Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a very enjoyable lunch and that the conversations and questions and insightful discussions continued. I think we can all agree that this morning was absolutely fascinating, and we're very much looking forward to continuing now. So our next panel will challenge the traditional framework of the Catalogue Raisonné and highlight new approaches to recording and systematizing the artist's oeuvre. The panel will be moderated by Amanda Gray, partner at Mishcon Reya and co-chair of the Art Lawyers Association. So, Amanda, please, over to you.
I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this panel. I'm stepping in for someone who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but I'm delighted to be joined by Lisa Feuvre, the Executive Director of the Holt Smithson Foundation, and Arie, her Hartog, Director of Gerhard, Marcks' Haus, and also author of Hands Up, Sculpture, A Critical Survey, and Sophie Tauber Art Oeuvre Catalogue. We're going to start off this session. Please do come in. We're going to be starting off this session just with a brief overview, first from Lisa, in terms of the work of the Holt Smithson Foundation, with some beautiful images. And then we're then going to move on with a presentation from Arie. And then we will open it up for a conversation between the three of us. I will joining in and also discussing legal aspects. You heard earlier this morning from Simon on legal aspects around the written Catalogue Raisonné. I will be reflecting on that and considering what changes there might be if we're looking at a different world, a different way of explaining the Catalogue Raisonné. So it's just slightly moving on and looking to the future. So I'll be chipping in with my 5p's worth of what it's worth. So without further ado, can I hand over to you, Lisa, just thinking about and reflecting on what we heard in terms of the discussions we had this morning, both in terms of the written Catalogue Raisonné, the digital Catalogue Raisonné, and also the decolonisation, if that's at all achievable in terms of the Catalogue Raisonné and frameworks.
I mean, all of those things. This morning was just great. My mind is firing with questions and problems. And there's a phrase that Laura used that I think is fundamental and foundational to thinking about Catalogue Raisonnés, which is cultural continuity. So, as you said so kindly, Amanda, I'm the Executive Director of Holt Smithson Foundation. We are a very unusual organisation, and we're going to do a kind of Catalogue Raisonné, and we don't want to, and we're going to do one as well. So my task is to look after the legacies of two artists, Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson. The images you can see right now are their best known works. These works are many things at the same time. They are earthworks, they're sculptures a long way from art world metropolitan centres. There are associated drawings, photography, essays. The journey is part of the artwork. So this sense of process is fundamental to both of these artists' work. We have so many problems with our approach to the Catalogue Raisonné. As far as I know, and I would love it if I'm completely wrong on this, there has not been a Catalogue Raisonné written on artists who are from more the conceptual tendency, where the thingness is not relevant to the artwork. Robert Smithson said, in the case of a great artist, and like all great artists, or like all artists, Smithson thought he was a great artist, a glance can be an artwork. Can you catalogue a glance? Of course you cannot. A glance is a context. It's an attitude rather than an object. So what we are doing is we are creating, and I'm stealing a phrase from you, Arie, not a Catalogue Raisonné. We are creating an atlas of artworks. Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt were very interested in ideas of place and all of those complexities. An atlas is something that is always a flawed project. The great writer Borges, José Luis Borges, was a writer of great importance to both artists. There's a great short essay Borges wrote called On Exactitude in Science, where he talks about the impossibility of an accurate map. boundaries need to be redrawn. You can't have a one-to-one scale map, because if you did, it would be useless. So our approach to this kind of catalogue raisonné, to this atlas of artworks, is to provide a failed map, an orientation point that will be a beginning. So thinking about some of the beautiful phrases that we've heard already, a first word, not a last word. And so our intention with this is to create something that will stimulate debate, dissensus, discussion. And what's so terrifying about doing this is we're very aware in developing this that we will be the first catalogue raisonné, again, as far as we know, of this type. So we will be pulled apart and critiqued. And for us, that's what the artists do. So it's exciting and thrilling.
Around that, can I ask, thank you. Around that, can I ask, you've chosen the word an atlas and talked about maps as well. Was there, and also that you were very much aware that the catalogue raisonné was flawed. We've talked about this, you've looked at catalogue raisonnés yourself. Was there debate within your foundation about whether you should be going down this route or looking at something else? Or are you thinking about it as something that you're describing it as a catalogue raisonné, but at the same time not as a catalogue raisonné? Are you almost exploring the negative space around the catalogue raisonné?
Sort of. I mean, we're doing a catalogue raisonné, in fact, for legal reasons. So Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt were both born in 1938. Smithson passed away in 1973, and Nancy Holt then looked after his estate until she passed away in 2014. And Nancy Holt, like many artists, had a vague and tautological will. She left her archives to one institution and everything else to the organization that has become Holt-Smithson Foundation. Both artists have an extremely blurred boundary between archive and artwork. So we are bound to do this because it was a very complex process to work out how the two sides or two elements of these artists' work would fall. And we agreed that what went in the catalogue raisonné will reside with Holt-Smithson Foundation. What is archival will reside with the Archives of American Art. So we need to do this to sort out a problem. But it's a problem, and one of the things that I love about art is just one big headache. It's not about truth. It's about thinking, it's about questions. This is why governments want to suppress art, because it's so complicated and problematic. So for us, this is really foundational to the ways in which their artworks are thought through. So just as a random example, the image you can see right now is an automatic drawing made by a thermograph, which is a measurement of temperature. Is this an artwork? Kind of. Is it archival? Kind of. And it's really about thinking how one walk the both and around these artists' works. So although it's a legal reason why we're doing it, it's actually quite thrilling because it's thinking about how artworks move through the world. So the reason why, again, why we're calling it an atlas of artworks is when we look at an atlas, if you pick up an atlas that was published 10 years ago, the boundary lines are incorrect. They're contested. They're completely created through empire, imperialism, value, trade, and they're a problem. And so an atlas is something that we really want to embrace these problems. And so I think in art gives you no truth, yet we desire it. The catalogue raisonné, in theory, is a truth, but it's a truth, not the truth.
And then multiple voices. We should come on to that because I've got so many questions I want to ask. But Arie, I want to hear from you, and let's. Can we move on, please, to Arie's presentation here?
Yes,
and then we'll come back.
Okay, in my case, it's back to thingness. It's about old-fashioned sculptures. The Gerhard Marcks Haus holds the bequest of this German artist. It was opened in 1971, and the first thing that was done there was that the museum started making a Catalogue Raisonné. Just by this idea, now we have a museum and we have a Catalogue Raisonné, and by that, this artist is becoming visible. And the interesting thing at that point was that it actually turned out to be the absolute correct decision, because over the years, Gerhard Marcks has become this main figurative sculptor in German art history. Also because of the fact that from the beginning on, the museum has started to keep track of all the actual objects. If you are looking at the Catalogue Raisonné, you have some 1,000 entries. If you then look how many objects there are, you're talking about 11,000 objects. And there is, of course, a very big difference between, compiling a Catalogue Raisonné of 1,000 objects or trying to keep track of 11,000 of objects. We'll come back to that later. Then in 2004, as a member of the German Association of Sculpture Museums, we published guidelines for compiling a Catalogue Raisonné for sculptors, which is 15 rules you should apply when you make a Catalogue Raisonné for sculptors. And the interesting thing is, since then we made quite some of these catalogues, and we never took all the 15 rules, because it's impossible. But those rules are, for the perfect kind of Catalogue Raisonné. Here on the left side, and I will not talk about the right side, is the sculptor Gerhard Schreiter. You will not know him. He is a important sculptor for Berlin and northern Germany in the 1950s. And I think that is also one thing that we should talk about, the Catalogue Raisonné. It's a tool. And what is the reason for the tool? One of the reasons for the tool might be to identify any object. The other thing, which is a very important part of it, is by having this tool, you make an artist visible. Because there is a Schreiter Catalogue Raisonné, everybody now thinks that sculpture is important. Because everybody who is in German sculpture in the 1950s, early 1960s, looks into this book and then starts referring all the other information he or she finds to this book. So by such a book, you kind of make the artist you are working with important. And I think that is also on the other hand, a Catalogue Raisonné cannot do everything. Shannon was talking about the Swiss knife. Have you ever tried to, put a nail in a wall with a Swiss knife? So that's very important. We have to think about when we use it as a tool. Well, what's the design for? What do we need it for? So I think that is a very important thing. We have made quite some Catalogue Raisonnés at the Gerhard Marcks Haus, but I will now come to something completely different, and this is Heinz-Günther Prager. But then in 2009, I was asked to work on Hans Arp, because of the experience we had when it comes to sculptures and when it comes to the whole problematic issue of editions within sculptures. Because the idea is, of course, still that you have a sculpture and you have the edition, and the edition is made at once. Well, they are never. So but the point is, how do you make that visible? And the Art Foundation that contacted us, we said, well, we can do it, but you have to show us your archives. It took them about a year to decide. And then after a year, we were finally allowed to go into these archives and to see actually what had been done. To show you the overall problem, if you go into the two catalogues raisonnés of Hans Arp on the sculptures, just the sculptures, and you would count all the entries that are in there and the editions, you end up with about 1,600 sculptures, objects that should be existent. If you then start an inventory of the actual existing objects, you'll end up with some 3,600. That is quite a lot more. So then that is the interesting thing, of course, when you are not involved. I mean, I do not like Hans Arp too much, so it's for me, you know, it's a scholarly exercise. But going into that exercise, it becomes then interesting from an art historical point of view, and that's what I show you this diagram. On one hand, you have the orange part, and the orange part is, if you go into to the Catalogue Raisonné, you will see that he made sculptures in the years. So in 1930, he made, I think, 2 sculptures and so on. So that is and the other one is the blue ones, and that shows the production of bronzes after these sculptures. And if you put these two next to each other, you see an interesting kind of, on the one hand, relationship. You see, first of all, that anybody who tells you he has an old Arp from before 1950 and he's not Peggy Guggenheim is a liar. Because they were all, you know, made later on. And then it becomes interesting, if you start to think about Catalogue Raisonné, is when they were made. Now it's, so what we see here is in 1957, the first Catalogue Raisonné is being published, and that's exactly, you know, when the production of bronzes goes up. Why? Because the Catalogue Raisonné is a sales catalogue. What do you want to have? Here, look. Do you want to have more? Call me. That's about the whole idea of it. And the same with then the late one, 1966, the posthumous. The other thing which is very interesting from this, and that's where it then becomes, in the earlier presentation, there was, she spoke about the ecology of an artist. Well, we also have to think about that when we talk about modern artists. In this case, you see this very high line in about 1966. In 1966, Arp made 30, I don't know, some 40 sculptures. In the letters you read from his wife, it says, he can hardly move. So there was a firm that was making the sculptures. But that firm was not only making the sculptures in 1966, that firm was already making the sculptures earlier on. So the whole question that we are always thinking about, you know, we have this genius artist who made this and so on. Well, I think, and the very moment you go into sculpture, into the question of production, of the whole kind of ecosystem a sculptor works in, like Lisa said, well, it becomes messy, but it becomes interesting. Last one. You see on the right top is the first sculpture that is in the Catalogue Raisonné. And to the left, you see an earlier sculpture that was already published earlier, but it's not in the Catalogue Raisonné. And I've always been thinking, why has that not been put in the Catalogue Raisonné, although the people who made the Catalogue Raisonné knew it. They knew the piece. Well, the explanation is rather easy. It is a piece that was owned by a friend, whereas the piece on the right top was owned by a famous collector. So you should start your Catalogue Raisonné with a work owned by a famous collector, so that all the other collectors in the world think, oh yes, I also will have to have one. So that's politics behind, you know, historical Catalogue Raisonné. And on the other hand, when you are working on it, you'll see that you always are having similar thoughts nowadays. The other thing is very funny. Is a stone, and that is where it's really getting messy. It's very easy to make Arp. Really, the very moment, if you know the skill, if you have, you know, the sculptural skills, and you can go to any stonemason's course and you see all kinds of Arps because they're so easy to be done. So in this case, an Italian, he got himself a small bronze, gave it to a stonemason and said, well, make me a big one. So he made him a big one. And then in the 1970s, Arp had already died. The owner goes to the widow and says, you know, we have Arp. Oh, I didn't know we had ARP. You had an ARP. We didn't know that size. Oh, that's not an ARP. It's a illegal kind of copy that's been made. But, well, let's discuss this. Oh, but, you know, wouldn't you write us an authentication? Something, write us something. Yes, okay, I will write you something. This is work that's been made by a stonemason after a work by ARP, but it should not be sold. So what happens, of course, the piece has been sold by now, and so it's a very, 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 you know, messy, complicated thing. And from a art historical point of view, I think it's very interesting to, you know, document these kind of things. As in the case of ARP, we have the documents, we know it, and we can show it. And in most cases, these, you know, aspects tend to be invisible or be held invisible.
And how do you deal with them? So we heard in the first presentation about with the Joseph Wright of Derby Catalogue Raisonné, you have the Catalogue Raisonné, and then there was the sort of the grey, the shadow land of that wasn't included. How do you reflect? Do you reflect that at all in the Catalogue Raisonné, or do you just keep it separate in terms of records?
One of the most important thing of this critical inquiry, and that was, you know, this one point of jurisdictional genius that I had in my life, was that I said, this is not a Catalogue Raisonné. And as that was in the book, you know, nobody can sue me. So and then for this, we actually put in the book the story. This is a posthumous work that has been made after a well-known work by ARP, and so on, blah, blah. So that's the way to deal with that.
Yeah, because it's interesting. You both raised points in terms of. I'll come on to the difference when you're dealing with sculpture. We'll come on to that in a minute. But in terms of that collision between the world of exploring the artist as well as the clash with the commercial aspects is a fascinating one, particularly in relation to the slide we're looking here, where it's known, you have a known actual work on the left-hand side, and yet it's not included for very commercial reasons. And it's to your point as well about the drivers of who is actually the author here. If it's one voice, what is there? It may be one version of a story, but there might be a multifaceted approach in terms of approaches to that artist's work.
I think that's right, and it's that multifaceted approach that I find really exciting about Catalogue Raisonnés, because if they're, I'm going to be using this phrase a lot now, if they're the first word, the tool of a Catalogue Raisonné is to inspire a counter argument, is to inspire a scholarly publication in whatever format it could be, that looks at questions of reproducibility, of copies, to inspire an exhibition. So it's a starting point. And I think that this sense of authorship is also really important, because all authorship is partial. And the Catalogue Raisonné method statement needs to claim that partiality so that it can be situated in time and in space, and in a context of intellectual ideas that will then be rethought at another moment. And I think there's also a question about the different modalities of research for a Catalogue Raisonné. So over lunch, Arie and I were talking to Erica, who's working on the beginnings of a Catalogue Raisonné. Erica is a bookkeeper, not an art historian. Arie and I said, yes, you're the perfect person to be doing this, because it's about truth, it's about facts, it's about bringing everything together. That kind of work is beyond my competence, because I'm so curious. I'll pick up a particular 35mm slide by Robert Smithson that I define as a sculpture, because it's the only material trace of a sculptural event. And then I start thinking about all of the questions. I cannot focus because of the complications.
You do not want to have the other 3,000 slides.
Exactly. So in a way, I think the authorship of a Catalogue Raisonné is always, or should always be done by many people, because it's a research process. Yet there needs to be accountability. In the same way that in organizations, there's usually someone, for better or worse, who is in charge. That person is in charge because ultimately they are accountable for everything that goes wrong. The institution is accountable for every single success. And so that sense of following the trails becomes really important.
Is that is quite a responsibility, because I saw it before as if you had a multiplicity of voices, that the party that was, say, hosting it or was was a platform, and in some ways was sidestepping the issues that people are facing or concerned about in terms of you have said that this work is by X. I have relied upon you to say this, and I have bought this work on that basis. But you're bringing it back and saying that the foundation or whoever the platform is does have a responsibility.
I think so, but we're in a really different case because neither Robert Smithson nor Nancy Holt are big ticket artists in terms of the financial value of the artwork. It's a very different animal from something that could be a specific, unique painting that could be looked at. So because of that, the biggest challenge is where the limits of the artwork are. So there's certain artworks by Nancy Holt where if you acquire a work, you acquire an authenticity certificate. That's it. There's no material form, yet it's a sculpture that fills a room. And with the images that I showed of Spiral Jetty and Sun Tunnel, Spiral Jetty, Smithson's most referenced artwork, I would always argue not his most important artwork. The artwork is owned by a collection, but the land on which it sits is owned by another entity. How can that be? Yet that is fundamental to the work, because the artwork is something that, as Smithson said, is in constant dialogue with nature. And then there's another complexity, that the material form of this spiral, it's not going to be there in 20 years because of the climate emergency, because of overpopulation in the region. The conditions means that every day it's reducing and it's reducing. And the artist specified that it should not be built up. So it's a mire, a mud or a swamp of complexities. And I think that where we need to think is that we need to think about where there are systems and conventions. The system and convention of the most traditional catalogue raisonné is the starting point for how we can look at, in our time, we're saying much more complex artworks. But we're saying that because in every version of the present, we think our time is the most complicated. In 20 years' time, we'll think, it was so easy in 2025 to define what an artwork is. And this is, again, why art is so important. It's not fixed, and it's that porosity that gives it its power.
Arie, you talked also about sculpture, and we talked about landworks and everything else, because the landworks are sort of the end part of the journey in terms of the artworks that you're dealing with. Are there particularities, if I start with Arie first, are there particularities about sculpture that make it particularly difficult when you're looking at the Catalogue raisonné exercise or a similar project?
No, the very moment you go into the 60s, it becomes complicated. I mean, the thing is, that's why that would be the one. Well, if you talk about Heinz Günther Prager, a steel sculptor from the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s. Well, that's also something. It's very easy to make it. I mean, if you have the size and you have a factory, well, you can do it. So that is that is the whole idea of the involvement of the artist, and that was the idea of the conceptual artist, changes, and by that also the status of such a catalogue raisonné becomes a complete different one, because in this case the artist, he himself was the one who started with the idea, because he said, well, I do not want to have too many of these objects. I want to decide that it's an edition of 3. So you can do it 2 times more. That's about it. So that is something that changed, or that changes, I think, in the 1960s.
And then in the 1960s, there's so many other complications. So many artists, Robert Smithson is one, Dan Graham is another, made magazine artwork.
Yes, also.
Okay, what about a magazine artwork, which comprises the artist buying advertising space in an art magazine, making an artwork for those pages? Okay, does that go in the Catalogue Raisonné? Of course it does. It's a really important artwork. So how do you have it in your paws? Well, you can't get hold of every single art magazine that was printed. Do you get the original paste up that was going to go into the magazine? Well, no, because that's not the work. So I think that this moment of the 1960s, there's a great phrase that Marin Sullivan uses, which is distributed sculpture. It's where the sculpture is many things, yet the artist, and I would say art history, will still see it as a sculpture because it's departing from the idea of a solid 3-dimensional object, something that deals with gravity, something that needs to be observed in the round, something that defies documentation, something that changes with light. Sculptures are always a big problem in every single way, but then it is expanded even more during the 1960s.
I mean, for example, to return to Hans Arp, there's a Catalogue Raisonné on his sculptures, there's a Catalogue Raisonné on his prints, there's a Catalogue Raisonné on his reliefs. But the fun thing is when you combine those 3. So, I mean, and even if you would include the drawings, if you would include the collages, because in the case of Arp, the market requested a Catalogue Raisonné of the sculptures because you could sell them so well. But from the actual working process of the artist, well, I think I'm going to do a sculpture now. And then afterwards he made a drawing, and so you have a complete different kind of, of approach of that artist. And the interesting thing is how and that is where, the digital comes in, whether we will be able to, show that kind of process in the future.
And Arie, in that case, will you define the sculpture as one catalogue number, the drawing as another catalogue number, or would you bring them all into?
Well, we are at the moment, but this is very preliminary. That would be, something for the 10th ICRA conference. We are talking about we are thinking about an ecosystem where we then also say, well, not everything is in there, because it will be in the case of Arp, he has made so much, and like I said, it's so easy to make an Arp. It will become very, very difficult to make something with like the standard of a Catalogue Raisonné, but something where you make the working process of this artist visibly. That's the goal now.
It's really fascinating to hear you both talk, because you're talking about ecosystems, you're talking about an atlas, and it's a very, I say it's a widening out of the whole project. So for me, when I'm thinking about something legally and you're thinking about the use of the Catalogue Raisonné, you're thinking about it in terms of attribution. I'm either thinking of it in terms of somebody who's entering into a transaction, and they're thinking, is this work correct? Is this work worth what I'm about to pay for it, or I'm about to sell for it? What am I thinking about here? Or in terms of the context of a litigation or a dispute, you're thinking, well, was it in, was it out, was it excluded? These kind of question marks. And it's a big factor about whether something's included or excluded, or a client may come being quite excited about the prospect that it's on the approach road to being included. Well, so it's not actually in there though yet, is it? And there's a big difference. So there are these things that are key things in terms of attribution, authenticity and value for me. But the way you describe it for me is far more exciting, because it ignites discussion. You've talked about it as a starting point. You've talked about an ecosystem, about widening out. And certainly when you've got work such as you're describing, where you may have a land work, but there are other pieces you showed on your slide deck, lots of other materials that wouldn't have, there wouldn't be the monetary value, which we heard from last speaker as well about. It's not about the monetary value; it's about something else entirely.
Maybe it's about what you're talking about are negotiations. Maybe it's about thinking through the intellectual negotiation of each artwork. So a major challenge for our foundation, we're a very unusual foundation for poetic and pragmatic reasons. Our foundation will only exist for 20 years. We became active in 2018. We will terminate in 2038. And in that time period, we can only do so much. So I think we always need to remember, and it's been a ghost haunting us so far today, is there's always logistics. There's never enough time and never enough money to do a catalogue raisonné. But isn't that the case for every single aspect of life? There's never enough time. There's never enough money. And art is part of our being. So for us, we only have a certain amount of time. And because we are a terminating foundation, every single object we have needs to be dispersed. So we often will answer a question when we're looking at an artwork in terms of the Atlas of Artworks. How would this exist when it leaves us and goes to a collection? But we're not talking about the financial value. We're talking about the next home for the artwork. Because we are a terminating foundation, we don't want to own anything at all. And because we are an American organization, it's a very strict audit process that we have. Even our pens, we need to know where they're going to go to, otherwise we're in trouble with the IRS. So it's this sense of, where does an artwork find a home? And how will a museum look after it? So in the case with Robert Smithson of an artwork that was a sculptural event, the museum will acquire a 35mm slide that should be in the sculpture department. There is a sculpture, yet it's this 35mm slide, an obsolete material that needs to be scanned. If it's shown, it's a photograph, yet it's still a sculpture. And these questions, these negotiations are part of the meat of the artwork rather than being supplemental to it.
At the beginning, you were talking about the split by virtue of the will, and it was being generated for a legal reason. Are there works where there are certain associated documentations and negotiations that are going to one home and other ones that are sitting with the foundation? Is there a split such as that, or are things being kept together? How does it work?
It's a really good question. Anything that is supplemental and anything that could not be shown as a single autonomous object, it goes to the archives because it's archival. Right. There might be suites of work that would stay together, but it's complicated because the artist made it complicated. Smithson says a glance can be an artwork. Well, we can't divide glances. Nancy Holt said everything that I did not throw away is an artwork. That's just not the case at all. It's impossible. There might be a little scribble. No one's going to want that at all. So we are, and I'm sure if there's any artists in the room, you will throw tomatoes at me. Sometimes the artist is not the best judge, but then also artists will say, that drawing I made in 1956, it's terrible, I'm not interested in it. And then we look at it 5 decades later, and it's just on fire because it's so wonderful. So I think it's also the sense of how artworks sit within the realm of art. And I remember many years ago, and I really don't know if this is still the case, the Catalogue had a rule that you could not write your doctoral dissertation if an artist, until an artist had died at minimum of 35 years ago, because the logic was that you needed that amount of time to percolate the ideas. But of course, now we talk about Catalogue Raisonné for living artists. Contemporary art history is so much quicker than that. So it's a complication, and the only way, because I have this terrifying job to do, the only way I can sleep at night is thinking, well, all I can do is make a proposal that will be rewritten in the future. But then from a philosophical position, maybe that's what art always is. It's a proposal for perception, for thought, whether it's a painting, whether it's a sculpture, whether it's a bit of old biscuit. And that's what we work with.
And then Arie, in terms of the ecosystem that you're pursuing, is there a time frame that you're thinking of? Lisa's talking about she's got a terminal, there's a terminal end, there's an end to this project that they're working towards and it's very much in mind. And what about you in terms of the ecosystem?
Well, the situation is different. I mean, we're a state-funded foundation, so that makes life a little easier. So I can now make plans for people in the future to do. That's what we do. Yes. So we're especially when we're talking about that ARP project, we're talking about a very long-term project where we are trying to involve as many people as possible. As that is something that not one person can do, because the information is, there are so many collections that have things that have something to do with ARP, and it's very, very, very difficult to well, first of all, to find them, then to find out how the provenance is, then to find out what the actual status of all these things is. So that is just a kind of a future project. But it's interesting. I mean, it's a very, those kind of projects are also very important, to think about. Just because by thinking, how would we do it? So how would you do it? Then a year ago, it turned out that you can actually look at imagery via AI. Oh, now it becomes interesting. How can you use AI to assist you when it compile imagery? Well, that's an interesting thing where we are at now, and we'll see in what direction that goes.
Exactly, and you're both talking about, you're describing living documents, evolving documents, things that aren't static. And is your work wholly digital for both of you, or is it a combination of both?
Oh, this is a book.
Well, that's
definitely a book. No.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, of course, there was earlier this the question of the status of a book. But for our point of view, what we have seen over the years was that, especially the oeuvre of mostly of Schreiter, but also of other sculptors that we made Catalogue Raisonnés of, was that oeuvre, the name becomes a dump. Whenever you don't know who it is, you give it that name. And then it's very good to have a Catalogue Raisonné that shows very clearly, no, it's not. Not every figurative sculptor from Germany from the 1950s that you do not know is a work by. That's also a function of a Catalogue Raisonné. So that is to protect the name of your artist, because there's a lot of bad figurative sculpture.
And I want to I wanted to ask you, in terms of the significance that you think that a Catalogue Raisonné has for the artist's identity, their legacy. What's your view on that?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of artists think about a Catalogue Raisonné. What I always thought was interesting is the case of Gerhard Marcks. He was at the Bauhaus, and at the Bauhaus he had friends like Paul Klee and Lionel Feininger. And after having spoken to those two, he then said, oh wow, you know what, they are not only good artists, but they're also good bookkeepers, because they actually keep book of what they are doing. That's what I'm now going to do. So from 1923 on, Gerhard Marcks kept book of every sculpture he made. That also, of course, made it easier to make a Catalogue Raisonné afterwards, although a lot was missing, and that was nonetheless included. But the interesting thing is there is this kind of, also nowadays, for an artist to be visible, it is very important to have your administration working. And that is something what you can see with a lot of modernist artists in the 1920s, that they start thinking about that and actually do it.
Yeah, I'm finding it a lot with artist clients who are in their lifetime, they're thinking about this, or they're thinking, I haven't got the infrastructure, or I need something in place around. I'm conscious that we've got 10 minutes in this session and we're back to back. I wondered, are there any questions at all from the floor? Anyone would like to answer? We have a question here at front, if we can have a mic.
Thank you so much for everything you have explained to us. I have a question about those 15 rules to make a catalogue raisonné for. Where can we find this list?
Very easy. Very easy. You Google guidelines for compiling a catalogue raisonné of sculptures, and you will find it.
Do they still stand today?
Yes, they do, and it's interesting that if you would actually use all the 15 rules, well, you got a lot of work.
Any other questions from the floor? At the back. Any other question? Oh yes, we have a question here.
For artists such as you've described, where the process of their thinking and the understanding by a larger public of what their art is, how do you formulate guidelines and decisions, and do you archive your protocols and then revisit them on some sort of regular basis? How do you kind of keep track of that, your thought processes in response to what you hope to ultimately implement in a consistent way over time for a catalogue raisonné?
I mean, the answer is yes, absolutely. So I'm talking at the moment where over the last year, I have written the first catalogue raisonné methodology. No one has seen it other than my team. In February, it will go to our catalogue raisonné committee, who are critical friends. I love critical friends, and experts who will look at everything from every angle. We will then keep this as an internal document. And there's there's two activities going on. My job, because this is my obsession, that this moment of art making, is to come up with an attempt as a method, while one of my colleagues is gathering data. So the method comes from the data, but then the data will be tested against the method. There'll be this sifting out, and then very slowly we will start coming up with conclusions. So again, time is not on our side. When we began our foundation in 2018, I said, 20 years, it's such a long time. Now my heart beats slightly when I think 2038 is around the corner. We research through exhibition. So Nancy Holt, as a female artist, there was limited scholarship on her artist. Museums paid her no attention until maybe 7 years ago or so, because that's the way it used to roll. Robert Smithson is just complicated from top to bottom. So when we make an assertion, we will test it through exhibition. And we'll look at the critical feedback. How does this work? How does this contribute to the understanding of the artist's oeuvre? But it's about immersing yourself, questioning, testing something that you think is wrong. It's like any system, really. And for us, our kind of temporal nature of our foundation gives us a great freedom. So we've all only do so much, and we will leave our work for someone else to improve. So everything is an experiment. There's freedom, but of course you want to test everything.
That's interesting. It's interesting you should identify sort of the disparity in terms of Nancy. Is that?
Well, I mean, it's a real truth. If we look at the scope of catalogue raisonnés that have been published, look at who those artists are, and it really relates to what you were describing, Arie, that it's in relation to the market.
Yes, exactly.
So until probably we not quite, but it was amplified since we came into the present. Nancy Holt was, she's Robert Smithson's widow. She looks after his estate, not she is Nancy Holt, the artist. And of course, that opens another complication that I know we can't talk about now, but I'm going to throw it into the room, is if there's an artist estate, who looks after that estate? What do they do? How do they present an artist to the world? What do they leave out? In the case of us, Robert Smithson, before 1963, made a lot of works that, using today's language, show his queerness. Nancy Holt didn't like that work, so she didn't let it out into the world, whereas we have no emotion at all. We want to make this work public. So it's a constant development and development.
And just goes to the point about these being living documents, being revised, the beginning of discussions at a point of time, and then being opened up again. Any other questions before we close? No. Thank you both. Oh, there is one. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi, I really enjoyed hearing both of you talk about your experiences working with Catalogue Raisonné and projects related. My question is about something you said, Lisa, you said about a catalogue needing to be written by many people. And I wondered if you could both talk about working with teams and who you work with, if it's all internally, if you're also working on different projects, or if you're also working with people externally, and what that's like.
I mean, maybe there's two answers to that. It's always going to be written by many people because you're working with sources that are out there. So you're reading what's been published, reading essays, looking at the work. But it's just such a massive job. For us, we are a tiny, tiny organisation. And we're just at the beginning, so it works with someone who's an information gatherer, who's not an art historian, who isn't actually interested from an art historical perspective, but who just wants the facts, determined to get the facts. And it's a process, and it's about talking to people. So it's very much a distributed network. And with our foundation, because I am the current executive director, I will write a method. I'm sure the method will be tested and contested by my successor when that time comes, and it will be developed. So I think it's the realm of art is the realm of intellectual work, and intellectual work is porous, and you have to be open. It has to be dialogical in some way. But then someone needs to say, enough, it's the end. Because it's never, Sharon, you're so right.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, it's in the 1980s when I started as an art historian, there still was, there were people who were actually saying this is a work by him or her because I say so, which I think at that point I thought that was quite an absurd kind of position. The funny thing is that you will still see that position very strongly, and it's one of the ways of at least criticizing that by method is by including others to question you. The very moment I say this is by this or that artist, and one of my younger colleagues says, well, I don't think so. Well, that puts pressure on me. So it's about creating a critical ecosystem. I think that's the idea. And then what we have heard earlier, a publishing house, a university, an institute can be such a critical ecosystem, and that is what it's about. Not about this, one of us goes somewhere and says, well, but this is real, you have to buy it.
Absolutely. Let's see. Thank you both. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear from both of you. And I'm sure if you have any other questions when we have a break, not after this session, but after the subsequent session, it will both be available later on. So thank you both. Thank you, Arie. Thank you, Lisa.